Well, welcome everyone to this Reimagining World Order lecture series program today. We're very happy to have you. As most of you know, Reimagining World Order is a program supported by the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, PIIRS, and we are in a multi-year project with seminars, talks, conferences, podcasts, collaborations with other institutions, with the intent of building interdisciplinary intellectual community, both at Princeton and abroad, and among students and faculty alike. So that's who we are. We're very happy today to welcome Matthew Specter, who will be our speaker today. Matthew is an intellectual historian of modern Europe, of Germany, of international thought. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for European Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And he's newly, I think, associate editor of the journal History and Theory. Matthew has written 2 books. His first book on Habermas, a intellectual biography, was published by Cambridge in 2010. And now we're very excited to say that Matthew has a new book. It just literally hit the world last week, entitled The Atlantic Realists, Empire and International Political Thought Between Germany and the United States, published by Stanford this year. So we're very pleased to have you, Matthew. Congratulations on your new book. I know you're going to share the screen and show us slides and present your arguments. So we're very excited about that. Our understanding is that you will speak for 40 or 45 minutes, and then we will open things up. So everybody on the line, you will be welcome to make comments and questions after Matthew speaks. So Matthew, thank you for coming and welcome to Princeton, if only virtually, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Eikenberry. Thank you, Dr. Tanuka, for organizing this this event. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm going to speak to you about my new book, The Atlantic Realists. So, realism's currency as a master narrative. Can everyone hear me? Make sure that I got the sound going. Okay. Realism's currency as a master narrative associated with prudence, restraint, and a sense of the tragic gap between intentions and outcomes has only appreciated in the last 20 years due to the ascendancy and exhaustion of neoconservatism. As Colin Powell famously warned of invading Iraq under the elder President Bush, if you break it, you buy it. In 2002, John Mearsheimer assembled a group of the most prominent American realists in academic IR to pronounce Bush's planned war in Iraq not in the national interest. The rise of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and its reconsideration of America's global role is thus a very welcome development. Today's anti-primacists, referring to US primacy in the world order, derive their inspiration from diverse sources. But for Patrick Porter and Andrew Bacevich, Quincy's director, classical realism is the well that can still feed the anti-imperial current. Of Reinhold Niebuhr, of whom Andrew Bacevich edited his classic Irony of American History, Bacevich writes, "It is time for Americans to give up their messianic dreams and cease their efforts to coerce history in a particular direction. This does not imply a policy of isolationism. Rather, it means ratcheting down our expectations. Americans need what Niebuhr described as a sense of modesty about the virtue, wisdom, and power available to us for the resolution of history's perplexity." The recourse to classical realism by thinkers affiliated with the Quincy Institute like Andrew Bacevich, Stephen Wertheim, and Patrick Porter is what I call realism's dissenting face, for it dissents from the imperialism that realism has historically authorized. Now, to be sure, classical realists like Hans Morgenthau and Reinhold Niebuhr did speak out eloquently against the sin of imperial hubris and the ways in which imperial adventures like the US and Vietnam failed to pass the realist signature test, namely, is this in the national interest? Now, imperial restraint is far better than its alternative, the pursuit of US primacy. And this quote from an excellent book by Patrick Porter explains what I mean by imperial restraint. The false memory of liberal order obscures what power politics involves, and it turns attention away from where it can lead, especially when the powerful inhale their own mythology. The task of contemporary American foreign policy should not be to adapt, reform, refresh, or rebrand this vision, the vision of a rules-based liberal international order. That vision put the US where it is now. The prudent response is instead to correct or at least restrain its flaws. So as I said, I believe that imperial restraint is far better than its alternative, but I would like to see the cause of restraint disentangled from the baggage of classical realism's late modern iteration, the North Atlantic realism of empire, whose historical development from orthodoxy to crisis and restatement is the subject of my history. Now, one way to envision this disentanglement, which I advocate, is suggested by the philosopher Richard Rorty. Disentangling restraint, prudence, and other sensible virtues from the metaphysics of realism resembles what Rorty counseled in philosophy as a retreat from metaphysical foundations. In Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, Rorty argued that the philosophers who claim to mirror nature in their reason would do better to give up their belief in the natural foundations for their politics and just get on with their work. Similarly, I believe we don't need a grand theory of realism to authorize smart decisions, policy decisions. Restrain yourself when you should, balance when you must. Common sense, prudence, what the Greeks called phronesis, practical wisdom, can't be found in doctrines. Indeed, the realists can't even agree amongst themselves what the implications of realism are for the US vis-a-vis China or Russia. Does realism entail defensive containment of China or offensive alliance with Taiwan? Why do some realists think that China's pursuit of regional hegemony must be countered, but Russia's challenge to Ukrainian sovereignty is just a matter of respecting the spheres of influence of a pure great power? The so-called rules-based liberal international order that has anchored US global hegemony for the last 7 decades is receiving fresh scrutiny from within the US and a variety of challenges from Eurasian empires with revanchist grievances. The current crises of liberal order are real, but they do not vindicate a return to the traditions labeled realist in international affairs. That the Chinese and Russians are studying Carl Schmitt should not warm any anti-imperialist's heart. The challenges to US hegemony from the global South that begin with the era of decolonization offer a more hopeful vision of what comes after American hegemony. Strategic restraint and multipolarity are only a halfway house to an internationalism worthy of the name. The crisis of liberal internationalism and liberal order also cannot vindicate realism, because realism is not liberalism's other so much as its disavowed shadow side. Furthermore, the realist tradition in political theory writ large that argues for the priority of order to justice must make room for survival too. The realists have no real vision of the planetary, and a realism worthy of the name must prioritize survival above all. Now, more than any other authors, the writings of E.H. Carr and Hans Morgenthau in the 1930s and 40s are the two most responsible for popularizing the notion of realism as a philosophical outlook. When Carr first deployed the term in 1939, it was as a counter-concept aimed at the alleged idealism, the utopianism, legalism, and moralism of Woodrow Wilson and the European supporters of the League of Nations. Morgenthau shared Carr's strategy of deriding this idealism, the utopianism of scientific man, the scientific man who failed to grasp the true nature of power politics. The realists told a story about their origins that centered on the so-called idealists who built a science of peace to prevent another great war. But in doing so, realists contributed to the myth of 1919 as a watershed moment when the old world gave rise to the new. But across the divide of 1919, the Euro-Atlantic powers continued to entrench racial and civilizational hierarchies, drawing a global color line that was analyzed by W.E.B. Du Bois and others. As Robert Vitalis, Brian Schmidt, and others have shown, before it was a science of peace, international relations aimed at managing the rising tide of color, of race, and shoring up the stability of empires. The dramatic story that realists like Carr and Morgenthau told of a heroic overthrow of idealism drew attention away from the deeper continuities of race realism, a kind of race realism visible in thinkers like Andrew Carnegie, Lord Bryce, Alfred Mahan, Paul Reinsch, and Lothar Stoddard. And by race realism, I mean an alleged realism about the inevitability of race war and the clash of advanced and backwards races. The narrative of realism's origins, most rehearsed since Carr and Morgenthau, figures the realists as heroes who rescued Bismarckian realpolitik from a failed Wilsonianism. A generation of scholarship from Alphonse Zollner and Marty Koskanini to William Scheuermann, Nicolas Guyot, and Udi Greenberg has rightly emphasized the role of German or German-speaking emigres, many Jewish and trained in law, who helped consolidate realism as a paradigm in American IR. But there is a danger, I believe, in overemphasizing the traumas induced by the collapse of liberal Europe. Kissinger, Morgenthau, Hertz, and Wolfers were all marked by their experience of Nazism and exile. But by making the sea change of the American mind the key moment of realism's consolidation, we risk making realism the saving remnant of the greatest tragedy in modern history. The realists emerge as the heroic protagonists of a redemptive narrative according to which liberalism would shed its illusions and become stronger. And I want to caution against this narrative that realism is the Shoah's bitter fruit. I tell a different story in which modern IR realism's origins are not the 1930s crisis of liberalism, but rather the transatlantic 1880s and 90s. Decades in which the two young empires of Germany and the United States embraced ideas that would help them compete with the global hegemon of their day, Great Britain. Emphasizing naval power as the key to world power status, the first generation of thinkers I call the Atlantic Realists combined ideas of Weltpolitik and Lebensraum into a mode of seeing like a world power. Realism took root in the academic and intellectual public sphere as a practical toolkit of the statesman contending with the globalization of imperial competition. Realism routinized the charisma of the imperial statesman. It provided its savoir-faire, the habitus of empire. The emigres from the Third Reich who contributed to the Germanization of American strategic thought during World War II are crucial to the intellectual history of realism. And they showed that the historians who made that argument, by focusing on the connections between the German and American traditions of thought, that was a critical connection to make. But I show that realism's German-American story is not only a one-way street, but a bi-directional flow, a set of exchanges that began decades earlier. Now, no thinker or set of thinkers ever called themselves the Atlantic Realists. I have coined the term, and I've done so to describe the family resemblances and genealogical connections I have uncovered in tracing the roots and branches of the modern realist tradition in IR. And not IR, not just academic IR, but what I call international thought. My research began with Morgenthau, arguably the central figure in modern realist international political thought. He is certainly the most cited author in the American field of IR and the main figure whom the neo-realists felt the need to challenge and overthrow. Morgenthau is also the well to which every neoclassical realist returns, as we saw in the Bush years, when the invasion of Iraq led to a kind of renaissance of appreciation for classical realism. So Morgenthau and his intellectual world, we might say, is the trunk of the Atlantic realist tree. And the Atlantic realists are therefore all those North Atlantic intellectuals whose transatlantic exchanges seeded the roots and grew the branches of that tree. Reconstructing this tree gives us, this genealogical tree, gives us the intellectual history we need to provincialize and historicize the limits of this tradition. And while I do not treat French, British, or other European or South American thinkers in my work, I believe that the category of Atlantic realism is capacious enough to accommodate more than just my US German story. Now, when Morgenthau first arrived in the US, he found himself marginal and embattled. As he wrote in 1958, when I used the term balance of power at the beginning of my career, it was then a kind of dirty word, something which respectable scholars would not use, at least not in an affirmative sense. And in a 1952 letter to George Kennan, he complained bitterly about the dominance of Wilsonians at Foreign Affairs magazine. They made it so difficult for people of our persuasion to get published there. But with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation and the impresario, his student Kenneth Thompson, Morgenthau evolved from insurgent outsider to insider and grew so confident that he could describe realism as essentially hardwired into the human condition. Realism, he wrote at a lecture at the Naval War College, 1947, is one of two and only two fundamental attitudes that a man can take toward a political and social problem. One is that reform can solve problems once and for all. The other, that problems are fundamental and can only be mitigated, transformed, but not eliminated altogether. Looking back from the 1970s, Morgenthau still described Scientific Man versus Power Politics as his, quote, favorite book. But it is a deeply Schmittian book, Carl Schmitt, that makes a fetish of power and the political as an irreducible, unmasterable force. To understand the power political and geopolitical elements in Morgenthau's thought, I turn to two major streams of thought in the Weimar Republic. The first was the writings on greater spaces, or Großräume, by Carl Schmitt and the concept of the political. The second was the geopolitics of the geographer Karl Haushofer. This in turn led me back to Friedrich Ratzel and Halford Mackinder, the two strongest influences on Karl Haushofer. Learning that the coiner of the term Lebensraum, Ratzel, had traveled extensively in and written admiringly of the great spaces of the United States drew my attention to the admiration of German liberal imperialists for America before the First World War. It also drew my attention to the German navalists who saw the US as their prime competitor and Mahan as a primary inspiration. These two histories by Goethel and Bonker helped me explore this terrain of the comparative and connected histories of the United States and Germany. In Schmidt, I found a fascination with American power and the Monroe Doctrine as a model that Germans could copy. In Haushofer, I found a nagging sense that German geopolitics was a belated science that had best catch up with the British and the Americans. Schmidt and Haushofer led me to the thinkers of the 1890s, Mahan, Ratzel, and Max Weber, and I alighted on a precise moment from about 1895 to 1898, when American and German thinkers were engaged in a particularly intense dialogue. As the Harvard professor of Russian history, actually, Archibald Coolidge wrote in 1909, England and France appear to us like two rich, long established and somewhat old-fashioned commercial houses. Compared with them, Germany and the US are like two young pushing firms that have yet their way to make. Wherever on the globe there is a good opening for trade, there we may expect to find the Germans striving in ardent rivalry. In his Freiburg inaugural of 1895, Max Weber also spoke of the vocation of great nations on the world political stage and the need to conquer elbow room. After the conquest of the Philippines in 1898, American political scientists Woodrow Wilson and Paul Reinsch and senators like Henry Cabot Lodge all described the emergence of the US from its isolationist immaturity and arrival on the main stage of world history. This is the discourse of world power or world political status. As a guest professor in Berlin, the political science Paul Reinsch was exposed to the debates on Weltpolitik that Wilhelm II, Admiral Tirpitz, and naval intellectuals had made from Ratzel's turn from land to sea power and Mahan's celebrated classic on sea power of 1890. In essays over the next 2 decades that followed Mahan's magnum opus, Mahan argued that the US must join the general movement of the white race in the possession of overseas colonies. If it did not, it would not remain among the first rank of civilized and great nations. So to sum up this first Atlantic realist moment of the turn of the century, Ratzel's Lebensraum, Max Weber's Weltpolitik, Coolidge and Reinsch on America as a world power. What all these had in common was a sense that the old Bismarckian Realpolitik, focused on the balance of power within continental Europe and hostile to overseas colonies, was in need of an update. Ratzel spoke of a truer Realpolitik, by which he meant Weltpolitik. And for Max Weber too, Realpolitik was a term he derided. True realism was connected to Weltpolitik. So the first Atlantic realist synthesis is significant for at least 3 reasons. First, my history challenges lazy associations of realism with Realpolitik. Realism was an insurgent concept allied to Weltpolitik, and explicitly opposed to Realpolitik. Second, I treat modern realism as the Bildungsroman of empire. It records the learning processes and practices of comparisons of two rising states, two young pushing firms their way have yet to make. I draw on the Bielefeld historian's work, Angelika Eppel and her colleagues, on practices of comparison as an object of historical analysis, and the constructivist practice turn to identities, roles, and rank in world affairs. I'm thinking of Vincent Puyo's recent work on pecking orders. Thirdly, Mahan's writings on the Monroe Doctrine and America's vital interests were the workbench on which early realist thought styles were first hammered out. In 1942, the American public became deeply agitated about an alleged Nazi superweapon, geopolitics. Reader's Digest proclaimed that there were 10,000 scientists behind Hitler, and emigres rushed in with books purporting to explain the exotic German specialty. Hollywood even created a short film dramatizing Haushofer, the strategic mind behind Hitler, and you can find it on YouTube, Plan for Destruction. One such public soothsayer was Father Edmund Walsh, a professor and founder of the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. In an article for Life magazine, Walsh created the scene in 1945, before Haushofer's suicide, when Walsh stood before him. And this is Walsh in his army uniform. Why could your government not send some experienced Americans such as Isaiah Bowman? Then too, there is a priest in a university in Washington whose writings I have collected. Any one of these would understand what I meant and what I endeavored to achieve by my geopolitics. Haushofer was facing trial at Nuremberg and was excused from testifying in exchange for writing a kind of apologia for geopolitics, or sort of a history account. Haushofer did not realize that the priest he had mentioned was standing right in front of him. As Walsh recounted in a book he wrote a few years later, I told Haushofer that he often reached 50% or somewhat better of sound truth. 10% evil must sink the vessel. That is exactly what happened to German geopolitics. And of course, these I flag these percentages to show you how comical this effort to distinguish between the American geopolitics of Walsh and the German geopolitics of Haushofer. And I'm trying to argue that the two are a subset of a larger transatlantic discourse that these intellectuals have trouble recognizing because of discourses of national identity. Between 1942 and 1945, a great reversal occurred among American strategic intellectuals. Isaiah Bowman, the leading interwar American geographer and advisor to Presidents Wilson and FDR, at first balked at the label the press appended to him of America's Haushofer. Who would want to be that? But within a few years, Bowman had embraced the idea that America needed its own version of geopolitics. Bowman's disavowal that America had ever thought in geopolitical terms, his preferred term was political geography, was deliberate historical amnesia. What he forgot and denied were the continuities between the American present and past. And when the new geopoliticians proclaimed the novelty of America's emergence from self-incurred immaturity, they conveniently overlooked the generation of Mahan and Roosevelt, as well as the generation that founded the Council on Foreign Relations, figures like Elihu Root, Isaiah Bowman, and the Rotzel student Ellen Churchill Semple, an important American geopolitician. The realism of the late 40s only seemed new. Now, at the same time that Schmitt was writing his Großraum theory and Haushofer articulating his fantasies of Russian-German alliance to control the Macindarian heartland, another major Atlantic realist was cutting his teeth in the Nazi Foreign Office. His name was Wilhelm Greve. Now, after the superficial denazification of the Adenauer period, Greve became an advisor to Foreign Minister Walter Hallstein and eventually West German ambassador to the United States. In 1984, Greve published a major history of international law that examined 5 epochs of hegemony in world history, but the book was substantially complete in 1944. Reconstructing Greve's intellectual and professional career in the Third Reich, I restored Greve to the realist canon and discussed how this Nazi-era book found a second life in the 1980s. And Greve is really one of the 3 central characters of my narrative. I think of a kind of triangle in which Schmitt is the apex of the triangle and Morgenthau and Greve are 2 branches that come from Schmitt. So I talk very much about the Schmitt-Greve textual comparisons and Schmitt-Morgenthau comparisons. In 1970, about 10 more minutes. In 1970, Greve published a major reflection on his years of diplomatic service, The Play of Power in World Politics, a hefty tome comparable to Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations. And in 1973, the political scientist Hans-Peter Schwarz reviewed it, lauding it as the rare example of a German book that exhibited the realism so much more prominent in the American academy and public sphere. He wrote, his book is a late German echo of the realistic school, by which he meant Morgenthau, Aron, and Niebuhr. Why did this tradition not gain a foothold earlier in West Germany, he wondered. Schwarz's lament reflected what he saw as the distorting effects of Willy Brandt's détente and the peace research institutes that had sprung up around West Germany since 1968. And in 1968, there was a conference at which representatives of the Frankfurt School, Marcuse and Fromm, debated Morgenthau and Hans Speyer and Morgenthau's leading German disciple, Gottfried Karl Kinderman. But by then, the mood was conciliatory, actually, because of the détente climate and the anti-Vietnam War climate. Schwarz's notion that realism needed to form an insurgency against a dominant liberalism was illusory. From the beginning, West Germany had been anchored in a transatlantic intellectual security community that included Morgenthau, Greve, and Kissinger. But it was true that by the time Germany had its first chair in international relations, the realist orthodoxy of Morgenthau had entered a kind of crisis. Doubts about nuclear deterrence, the debacle in Vietnam, the rise of German détente, and a generational shift in political science sent the realist orthodoxy of the 1940s to 60s into crisis. The crisis of the realist orthodoxy, represented by the Morgenthau of the 1950s, explains the failure of West Germany to synchronize the times of realism with that of the United States. I discussed the rise of interdependence theory, as well as an early form of constructivist critique of status and role in world society in the writings of this period. And so I'm talking about a crisis of classical realism that's observable in West Germany in the 1960s. And I argue that this crisis explains why Morgenthau's pupil, Kindermann, who was the leading advocate for neorealism in West Germany, never became as successful as the realists became in the United States. The synchronization came later. The waning of détente from the late 1970s in the US and West Germany created an opening for the reassertion of realist fundamentalism or orthodoxy through the mid-1980s. Morgenthau and Greve, both of whom had evolved away from realist orthodoxy in the 60s and 70s, now reiterated the fundamentals of geopolitics for this new phase of the Cold War. And within the space of a few years, the CDU's Helmut Kohl was announcing the need for a new realism, and Schwarz lamenting Germany's lost aptitude for power politics. And it's the same mid-80s moment when Wilhelm Greve finally publishes the book that was substantially complete in 1944, and which was written while very much serving the Nazi Foreign Office quite willingly. So, in conclusion, last paragraph. Tracing realism's transatlantic itinerary in the 20th century reveals the twists and turns, myths, ironies, and reversals that sprang from the comparative and connected history of realism and in the US and Germany. Its chief lessons are that realism's apologia for empire echo down to the present generation of realists, even when they are arguing for a measured sense of the tragic or the necessity of restraint. It is symptomatic that none of the mid-20th century realists took much notice of the most important development of the Cold War, the decolonization of the Third World. Focused on East-West bipolarity, containment, and the problem of anarchy in IR, they missed the biggest story of all, the Global South's challenge to hierarchies of race, culture, and capital. Realism's obsession with anarchy obscures the hierarchies and interdependencies that are the real drivers of conflict and consensus in today's world. Provincializing realism, therefore, is a step in the right direction beyond American hegemony and towards a more pluralistic and more egalitarian world order. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. That's terrific, and I'm very glad to bring back our audience here. And I guess what we'll do is just use the raise hand function. And I see as some of you with your video on, and that will help me see you and recognize you as well. Natasha, are you? Yes. I see Natasha and Tolia, so I'll take a list, but Natasha, why don't you start off? Just unmute yourself. Natasha, why don't you unmute yourself and you can go first.
I'm sorry, it seems my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Natasha, if you can unmute yourself.
Sorry, my internet connection's unstable. Hopefully this works now. Thank you so much for that, Matthew. That was really interesting, and I learned a lot of things. You have this very evocative phrase of realism as the Bildungsroman of empire, and that's really striking. I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because clearly you're only really talking about certain sorts of classically latecomer empires. And so I wonder if you could just kind of flesh out that argument for us. I found it very intriguing, but it wasn't entirely clear to me what you meant by it.
Yeah. Well, I guess the classic Bildungsroman is a novel of the formation of youth, of the education and development of youth, and so I'm trying to use that idea to describe the latecomer status or the youthful status of the American and German empires relative to the British and French in the late 19th century. But I guess the reason I use that idea is that I really feel like there's a process of the constitution of national selves, a kind of national self-discovery, and that the Atlantic functions as a kind of mirror, that the US is looking at Germany and seeing itself reflected, learning from this encounter and vice versa. And so I describe the Atlantic as a kind of hall of mirrors in which there's this sense of the comparability of these two experiences that helps constitute a sense of what it takes to be a world power, right? And what it takes to be an adult, because this is because the narrative of the attainment of colonies, of overseas empires, opposed to continental a continental focus. Mahan says that the Monroe Doctrine is the first moment that breaks with the inward-looking nature of Jeffersonian foreign policy. So I'm trying to just sort of, you frequently encounter these metaphors of, that America at the turn of the century is, emerging from its innocence and youth, right? And so I guess the Bildungsroman idea is meant to convey this transition from youth to manhood. And of course, manhood, there's a lot to do with gender and the sort of the manly art of seeing like a world power.
Toya, I think you're on the list, and anybody else, please put your hand function up.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you, Matthew. That was a fascinating presentation, fascinating subject of a kind of a tour de force, really. I really appreciate the presentation. And I wanted to ask you about a core relationship that you posited in the course of your talk. And this is similar to Natasha's question in a way, so I guess we can say this is a two-finger. I want to ask you specifically about the nature, the logical nature, not necessarily the historical, but the logical nature of realism's relationship to empire, imperialism. And there seems to me to be here a similarity to debates in imperial historiography about the relationship between liberalism and empire. And of course, we know there are a number of historians and political theorists who argue that liberalism is inherently imperialistic. And there are some political theorists like Alan Ryan who make the same claim. There are other people who say that the relationship is contingent. There are liberals who happen to be imperialists, but there is nothing in the nature of liberalism that conduces to imperialism. Now, it seems to me that, at least personally, I find one of the most fascinating aspects of your talk was this assertion that there is more than a contingent relationship at work between realism and imperialism, that there is something in the way that realism is configured that conduces to imperialism. And it specifically came through for me in your discussion of how realism was opposed to realpolitik, a kind of a Eurocentric realpolitik, and focused on this Weltpolitik, which was very much about the acquisition of Lebensraum and that kind of imperial organization of spaces. And I wonder if you could explore this connection a little bit for us and give us presumptive reasons, either for or against a particular understanding of a logical relationship between realism and imperialism. Is that relationship largely contingent? Does it just so happen that Carl Schmitt, for example. He happened to be an exponent of empire, and so those two ideas are wedded in his books. Or is there a more necessary relationship at work? And if it is more necessary, then how do you explain the fact that in later Schmitt, for example, in the Schmitt of the 1950s, in his dialogues on space, the idea of empire disappears? And you could almost say that in his critique of America and the Soviet Union, it's a kind of a call for a more prudent, a kind of a more redacted, a more Westphalian organization of geopolitical spaces. And imperialism doesn't seem to feature prominently, for example, in Hans Morgenthau's Scientific Man either. Is it a necessary or a contingent relationship? Please, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I guess I would say I wouldn't. I wish I had a great answer for you. I'll do my best. I guess I wouldn't frame it through the lens of contingency or necessity, but just that in its origins, that I believe that realism is imperial in its DNA. So I mean, if I have to choose between contingent and necessary, I'm going to go towards the necessary end of the poll. At the same time, I do admit that there are many realists who turned against the Vietnam War, who today's generation of realists, in arguing for imperial restraint. I mean, I think you could argue Basevich or something is certainly arguing against an American imperial role in the Middle East. So realism is a many-faceted tradition, right? So, I know William Scheuermann used to speak about the realism of war and the realism of peace with regard to Hobbes and Schmitt, and maybe we speak about, imperialist realism and anti-imperialist realism. In the course of my research, I came to think that there probably is an anti-imperialist tradition of realism. If you look at figures like Charles Beard, who was introduced to Eckhart Kerr, the critic of Wilhelmine naval imperialism, by his son-in-law, Alfred Wacht. And really Beard developed a kind of Kerrite critique of Mahanism in his national interest book. And that's a kind of, so I think that there could be, a robust anti-imperialist realism. So I guess in that sense, I'm arguing towards the contingency side. So I'm kind of the terms necessity and contingency don't really work for me. I guess I would think more, because I don't think, as a historian, I don't think that you can just identify these things logically a priori, right? So, historically, what I'm arguing is that the main trunk of realism was kind of embedded with empire, and that Morgenthau has an imperial blind spot. He may not talk about imperialism very much, but he's all for the Monroe Doctrine, and I can trace a line from Mahan to Morgenthau, or from Monroe Doctrine to Morgenthau. And then what I'm trying to do is show that if you kind of do a global history, that isn't it interesting that the Monroe Doctrine is a through line between the American and German imperial histories from the early 19th century to, the late 20th century. So, so I guess I'm hewing towards the more necessary connection between the two. In terms of liberalism and empire, I've been influenced by Beata Jan's his concept or history of the theory and practice of liberal internationalism, in which she describes realism as the kind of disavowed shadow of liberalism. So I'm inclined to see liberal empire and realism as or liberalism and realism as two faces of the same Euro-Atlantic imperial coin. That means I'm, as a Habermasian, I'm not dismissive of liberalism in the slightest. I have a constitutional allergy to all left Schmittianisms. So I'm interested in norms. I believe in a lot of liberalism. I'm not out to get liberalism, but I do think that part of my problem with the history of realism is that it sees itself as the opposite of liberalism and overcoming the weaknesses of liberalism. And I would want to kind of reframe that debate around a more longue durée idea of empire and its realist and liberal faces. But brilliant question. Thank you so much. Really helpful.
Thank you so much. Chika, I have you next, and just anybody else on the line, just let me know. Chika?
Great, thanks. Thanks, Matthew, for a really interesting talk. I see this as a really fascinating sort of a critical genealogy project of realism, right? To say here are the true origins and real meanings of a term that perhaps we take for granted. But maybe just to respond to build on what you said to Toria, in the course of your research, did you also come across any alternative forgotten substrands of realism that you think might be worth reviving that could provide useful intellectual resources today?
Yeah, I've had that question before. Who are the heroes in your story? And one might imagine that I'm a very dyspeptic person to only work on people I disagree with, but no, it's not just a destructive operation, though I think there is some ground clearing that I'm trying to do. I do think the realist tradition is overrated and exerts a bit of a spell on our discourse. I listen to podcasts. I hear people talking about China. Is China acting out of ideology or realism? Well, no, sorry. Realism is also an ideology. You cannot simply. But to get back to your question, where are the turns that weren't taken, or the positive leads that I might follow? I got very interested in Beard and in Alfred Vogt, and I wanted to learn, as I tried to kind of deconstruct geopolitics and sort of geopolitics became a problematic concept in my book, I became skeptical of my own argument and said, well, wait a second, geopolitics has to matter in some way. There are probably incorrect ways of thinking and hypostatizing geography and determinism, but there has to be a critical geopolitical tradition. And so I want to look at, study more the roads not taken in critical geopolitics, to look at people like Yves Lacoste in France, or there's a Frankfurt School figure whose name I'm blanking on, from the 1920s, so those are sort of the but what then also, I'm sorry, I should have said this. I also am very interested in constructivism, and the sort of proto-constructivism that I find in people like Ernst Otto Czempel in West Germany. So I think the whole tradition of peace research has been sort of dismissed as utopian, and I want to sort of get into Dieter Senghas and Chempel and sort of see what I can learn for the present from those underappreciated thinkers.
Thank you, Matthew. Tamara?
Thank you so much. You've touched a bit on the myths of national interest in the way that realism is invoked in public discourse today. And there are, of course, many events, even in simply recent history, that are not, that can be seen as far from being in the national interest, but are part of the way that countries acted, often in the name of realism. Could you speak a bit more about the ways in which the theory, so the ideal form of realism, as encapsulated by Morgenthau and others, also promulgated those myths, right? So kind of disassociating a bit the theory of realism from the ways in which the invocation of realism was used to promulgate myths of national interest. Thank you.
You mean what were some of the logical flaws in the original theoretical formulations of national interest? Yeah.
Right. So if
Yeah,
we
okay.
kind of accept
Yeah.
that our theory is often then utilized in ways that may not be true to its roots, if I understood your argument correctly, even the theory itself was far from being kind of true to these arguments in favor of a national interest.
Well, so I think, I first encountered this concept of the national interest as a freshman in a seminar on ethics and foreign policy with Joseph Nye. And what I learned in that seminar, was that realists think in terms of the national interest, and moralists a la Jimmy Carter or want to append ethical considerations to the national interest. And my initial question about the national interest was, well, what is this thing and who decides? And is it objective? It seems like people are treating it as objective. And as I went through the political battles of the 80s in the Reagan era, and the Wall Street Journal was very happy that Nelson Mandela was in prison because, God forbid, a communist should be let out and we should lose access to the sea lanes and diamonds of South Africa. I learned to be skeptical about this category of the national interest. So to get back to the problem with the original formulations, I think that this is the sort of the classical formulations of national interest in Morgenthau are written, at a moment of great confidence in the American century and American exceptionalism. So there's no sense that national and universal interests might diverge in meaningful ways. There's also a kind of imperial blind spot that it may be in the U.S. national interest to have cheap oil, but what does that actually entitle us to? But then more broadly, I think that the problem with the realist formulation of the national interest is that it's not democratic. It's not deliberative. It's the intuition of the male statesman, the elite male statesman, who can, without any democratic input or deliberation or contestation, determine what the national interest is. So, I think and this is a legacy of the statism, the German statist tradition from Weber and Meinecke to Schmidt. So I think the problem with the national interest is it's elitist, it's undemocratic, it has an imperial blind spot, and it was often confused with universal interests. So I hope that answered the.
Thank you, Matthew. throw in a question. I'm interested in, as someone who has been following the trajectory of liberal ideas and liberal internationalist ideas across the 19th and 20th century and into today, the story of liberalism and liberal internationalism is often told in terms of crises and turning points when there are reconsiderations of liberalism and its vision, its programs. Obviously, after the failures of Woodrow Wilson, the interwar period, and then the post-war period, various moments when there were these shifts in the underlying imaginaries of liberalism. And I'm wondering what would be the equivalent in the most recent period for realism. And in particular, if you could take Morgenthau and tell us more about how that experience of Morgenthau. I have a dog here who's barking, so I'm going to be brief here. I'm sorry. Why don't you tell us about how Morgenthau grappled with Vietnam and how that may have had some catalytic effect on how he thought about realism and empire. I apologize for the noise.
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, Morgenthau, I believe he visited Vietnam already in 1955, and he was quite perceptive about the limits of the legitimacy of the Diem regime and began to editorialize very early in the 1960s. He ended up very close to Senator Fulbright's and Morse, and was the first public, I believe he was the first public official to go on record against the Vietnam War. And so by 1965, and that was 1965. So I mean, there was heroism there, and it's kind of inconvenient for my interpretation of Morgenthau. And as you may be aware, there's a huge secondary literature on Morgenthau. I mean, one of the challenging things about this project, I'm trained as a German intellectual historian. I had to become an Americanist. I went, it started out as a mid-20th century project, and it became much larger. So with regard to, so there's a huge cottage industry about how to interpret Morgenthau. The sort of more orthodox interpretation put forth by Koskanini was that Morgenthau really was Schmidt in America, in The Gentle Civilizer. And Nicolas Guyot has reaffirmed that interpretation, and I mostly hew to that interpretation. On the other hand, my good friend Bill Scheuermann, valiantly tries to rescue Morgenthau as a progressive and as a partisan of the world state and as a cosmopolitan who has been caricatured as, only being interested in the national interest or having nothing to say about morality. And so, and I have a long chapter on Morgenthau, which I call The Making of an American Power Politics, where I say, look, Morgenthau is not just German power politics, transported. It's not just the Americanization of Realpolitik or Machtpolitik. There's a learning process, and certainly the Vietnam era is a learning process. And as I said, it's kind of inconvenient for my theory. I think it's extremely interesting that the most left-wing foreign policy think tank in America, the Institute for Policy Studies, invited them onto its board. Richard Barnett and Marcus Raskin. So clearly Morgenthau evolved, and no, I don't ignore that evolution, but I argue that Morgenthau did a lot of damage in the 1950s. and that people who say that, Morgenthau often felt that he'd been misunderstood, and that perhaps by the end of his life, he probably saw his anti-Vietnam, his anti-imperial face as the real voice of Morgenthau. But, in historical terms, I mean, you have to take responsibility for he was his own worst popularizer. He often claimed he was more subtle than he was given credit for. His publisher made him add the 6 principles of political realism to make it more accessible in Politics Among Nations. But so I would say that, number one, we have to hold him responsible for the construction of a realist orthodoxy that did a lot of damage. Number two, he does evolve in the 60s. This is the shift, the turning points, the crises that you're talking about. I would say even more important for his, even more significant than Vietnam for, I'm not sure that, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure whether Vietnam changed his theoretical outlook on realism. I think that it was useful for the left to have a realist saying this is not in the national interest and there are realist grounds on which to oppose the war. But I'm not sure that Vietnam forced a genuine, coming to terms with the deficiencies of realism. The thing that did force coming to terms with the deficiencies of realism was nuclear weapons. And already in 1961, he's beginning to really think about the shadow of apocalypse and the sort of shared planetary fate questions, and to feel that that realism and this focus on national interest and the power political savoir-faire of the statesman was not enough to deal with this planetary crisis.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to just look around the room. Arch Davis, you're next.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Well, I had a couple thoughts. Certainly a tour de force. I really appreciate the discussion this morning. One of the things that's come out of that is that it's forced me to coin a phrase, nitrogen fixing politics. Nitrogen is everywhere. It's in the air, and you just gather it together, and it turns into fertilizer and goes underground. So if that brings us into the current day, where are we with regard to realism? And there's a lot of wonderful history here, amazing what you put together. But today we have people like Victoria Nuland, who I guess I would characterize as not a realist, but a neocon, and her husband, Robert Kagan, and many others who are maybe former Trotskyites who are now neocons. What is their influence?
Well, I mean, I'm not a professional foreign policy intellectual. I'm not completely up on what's going on in Washington and with those circles. I mean, I know that my sense is that neoconservatism doesn't have many partisans anymore. My sense is that Biden thinks of himself as some kind of realist, and that they're kind of groping their way towards a realist restraint policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. And I don't really have a problem with that. unless it leads to the full appeasement and the destruction of Ukrainian sovereignty, in which case I would have a huge problem with it. I mean, my problem with the contemporary realist discourse, which is that, you know, I heard Senator Sanders speaking on the radio the other day, and he said, "Look, what we need to do is, you know, I'm worried about all of this drive towards war. There's a, you know, and so yes, presumably there are neoconservative voices. I'm sure there are people in the Senate who are arguing that, you know, that Putin is Hitler and we need to draw a line and so on. But what Sanders was saying was, look, we need to be respectful of Russia's interests. We need to see things from the other guy's perspective. And he said, how would Americans feel if Mexico were to join, you know, the equivalent of the Warsaw Pact, right? Well, we would react. That would be in our sphere of influence. And Russia has its sphere of influence. Well, no, I'm sorry. I don't agree that there are these natural geographically determined or geopolitical spaces in which great powers, another kind of reified concept with an interesting intellectual history, in which great powers have prerogatives. Now, that may make me a naïf to say that that great powers shouldn't have spheres of influence, but I see a kind of, even in a left-wing realist argument like Sanders is making on Ukraine, I see a kind of normative capitulation that's very dangerous. I mean, a kind of naturalization of empire. And of course, that was what Mearsheimer, you know, Mearsheimer argued 10 years ago, that, or during the Crimea crisis, that the crisis was the West's fault. Why? Because America had overreached into Russia's sphere of influence. It had done something unnatural, right? And this goes back to my idea of Rorty's critique of metaphysics and nature. I just don't think that realism is a mirror of nature. Thanks for your question.
Sure.
Thank you, Arch.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. I want to, as we draw to a close, just step back and thank Matthew for a terrific session today, and to a book that is based on what we've heard today. I think we are all going to rush to the bookstore and buy it. So I think, you know, Matthew, a job well done, and you've given us a taste for work that I think will have basis for conversations that will continue for a long time to come. So thank you very much, and to everyone who's joined in, thank you as well, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, everyone. Learned a lot from the conversation.